The night air over Okinawa was heavy and suffocating, pressing down on men who had learned to live like shadows. Beneath the twisted silhouettes of palm trees and shattered ridgelines, a Japanese infantry squad crept forward, their uniforms damp with sweat, their rifles held tightly across their chests. For years they had relied on the night as a shield, knowing that darkness favored stealth, and stealth was their only advantage against an enemy who wielded overwhelming firepower by day. Tonight, too, they believed the blackness of the jungle was their ally. The cicadas sang, the distant rumble of surf echoed off cliffs, and their footsteps disappeared into the soil softened by rain. Yet what they could not see was that the darkness itself had turned against them. A faint hum of batteries, the faintest glow hidden beneath a soldier's helmet, and a click of a switch marked the beginning of a new kind of war. Across the ridge, American infantry crouched low, their eyes fixed not on the naked night, but through heavy scopes that shimmered with ghostly images unseen to the human eye. The rifles they carried were not ordinary carbines. They were fitted with bulky apparatus, thick cables connecting to power packs slung on assistants' shoulders, strange lamps mounted beneath the barrels. In the green-tinted screens of the M3 infrared carbines, the Japanese squad was lit up as clearly as if they were walking in broad daylight. The American patrol did not shout, did not warn, did not hesitate. Silent flashes spat from their barrels, invisible beams illuminating the targets. To the Japanese, death came from nowhere. Soldiers collapsed mid-step, clutching their chests, their mouths opening in cries that never reached completion. Others dropped without even understanding they had been fired upon. Panic spread. Confusion shattered cohesion. Men who had once trusted the night as their guardian suddenly realized it had betrayed them. For one young Japanese soldier, the horror was immediate. He had survived artillery barrages that churned earth into fire, had endured the thunder of naval guns and the sting of flamethrowers, but nothing had prepared him for this. The jungle should have hidden him, but instead it exposed him. He darted left, scrambled behind a log, pressed his cheek to the soil, heart pounding. Yet even here he felt the unseen eyes tracking him. A shot cracked. The man beside him twitched violently and lay still. He dared not raise his head again. The last thought that crossed his mind before darkness claimed him was that the gods had abandoned the night. This moment was not isolated. It repeated itself across Okinawa in the spring of 1945, as American soldiers unveiled a weapon the Japanese had never conceived possible. The M3 infrared carbine was not merely a firearm, it was a glimpse into the future of warfare. For centuries, darkness had been the equalizer of the battlefield. From ambushes in medieval forests to trench raids in the First World War, night allowed the weaker to slip past the stronger, the desperate to claw at the powerful. The Japanese army had trained extensively in such tactics, launching infiltration missions, night assaults, and banzai charges designed to overwhelm defenders in the blackness, where machine guns could not easily find their mark. But on Okinawa, that equation shifted. The American military had poured immense resources into research and development throughout the Second World War, seeking any edge that might shorten the conflict. Radar had given the Allies the ability to see planes and ships beyond the horizon, breaking the illusion of surprise. Code-breaking had stripped away secrecy from enemy orders. And now, in the closing months of the Pacific War, a weapon appeared that robbed the night itself of its protective shroud. The M3 infrared carbine was primitive by modern standards, bulky and awkward, but in 1945 it was revolutionary. It represented the first battlefield use of night vision technology, a system that turned invisible infrared light into images soldiers could see. For the Japanese troops who faced it, the effect was devastating. Reports filtered back to surviving officers of entire infiltration units being annihilated without firing a shot. Soldiers whispered of death rays and invisible lamps that betrayed their movements. Fear spread like wildfire, for men who had once taken comfort in the cover of darkness now realized that moving at night meant stepping into an unseen crosshair. What had once been a realm of opportunity became a killing ground. To the Americans who wielded the weapon, the sensation was almost surreal. A jungle path that looked pitch black to the naked eye glowed in their scopes. Every tree, every shadow, every crouched figure emerged in ghostly detail. Enemy soldiers appeared outlined against the landscape, unaware they had been revealed. For the first time in history, one side could fight as if the sun had never set, while the other stumbled blindly, trapped in a darkness that no longer offered protection. This is where the story of the M3 infrared carbine begins, on the shattered ridges and blood-soaked fields of Okinawa, where technology turned nature's oldest ally into a weapon of betrayal. The Japanese soldier who fell into the mud that night did not know he was part of a larger transformation, one that signaled the dawn of electronic warfare, where machines amplified human senses beyond their natural limits. His death, sudden and incomprehensible, embodied a truth his army could not accept, that industrial power and scientific innovation had stripped even the night from their grasp. The battle for Okinawa would rage for nearly 3 months, one of the most brutal campaigns of the Pacific, claiming over 12,000 American lives and more than 100,000 Japanese dead. Amid that carnage, the M3 played only a limited role, its numbers small, its deployment experimental. Yet its psychological impact was immense. It robbed the enemy of confidence, sowed terror in the ranks, and demonstrated in vivid fashion that the war's technological momentum lay entirely with the United States. From that humid night forward, darkness was no longer a sanctuary. It was a stage illuminated by beams the eye could not see, where hunters stalked the hunted with silent precision. And as the war edged toward its final act, the M3 infrared carbine stood as a symbol of what was to come, a new era in which human ingenuity could bend even the most fundamental elements of nature, light and darkness, into tools of war. In the bitter winter of 1940, long before American boots touched the beaches of Normandy or Okinawa, a small group of U.S. Army officers gathered at Aberdeen Proving Ground to review reports that would quietly set the stage for one of the war's most important innovations. Their problem was simple yet pressing. The standard infantry rifle, the M1 Garand, was too heavy and cumbersome for the thousands of men who served not as frontline riflemen, but as radio operators, mortar crews, truck drivers, engineers, and paratroopers. These men were expected to fight, if ambushed, but carrying a full-length 8.5-pound rifle slowed them, and a sidearm alone was far too inadequate. What the Army needed was something in between, a lightweight, compact, semi-automatic weapon that could be slung over the shoulder yet brought into action at a moment's notice. The request reached the desks of Army Ordnance, and a program was initiated with remarkable speed. Dozens of firms and designers submitted prototypes, but one stood out, the Winchester design team, which, working in feverish shifts, produced a functioning prototype of what would become the M1 carbine in just 13 days. When Army evaluators first fired the little rifle, they immediately recognized its potential. Chambered in .30 carbine, a cartridge lighter than the powerful .30-06 of the Garand, but far superior to a pistol round, it gave support troops the reach and firepower they had lacked. At just over 5 pounds unloaded, the carbine was less than 2/3 the weight of the Garand and nearly a foot shorter. Soldiers could march farther, move faster, and still deliver rapid semi-automatic fire when threatened. By late 1941, as America braced itself for war after Pearl Harbor, the M1 carbine had been approved for mass production. Contracts were awarded to an unlikely consortium of manufacturers, led not by traditional arms makers, but by industrial giants of the civilian economy. The Inland Division of General Motors, responsible for steering wheels and automotive parts, became the lead producer. Soon, typewriter factories, jukebox companies, and even sewing machine manufacturers converted assembly lines to churn out carbines. This was the essence of American wartime industry, mobilizing civilian plants and workers to meet the colossal demand of global war. By war's end, over 6 million carbines would roll off those lines, making it the most widely produced American small arm of the conflict. For the men who carried it, the carbine was a mixed blessing. In the jungles of Guadalcanal, New Georgia, and the Philippines, paratroopers and Marines praised its lightness and speed. A radio man could keep his hands free while still armed. A paratrooper jumping into Sicily or Normandy could strap it to his chest without the burden of a long rifle. Yet there were complaints. The .30 carbine round lacked the raw stopping power of a Garand at long ranges, and against fanatical Japanese charges, some soldiers found themselves firing multiple rounds to bring down an attacker. Still, it filled its role admirably. It was never meant to replace the battle rifle, only to arm those for whom a battle rifle was impractical. As the war dragged into its third year, combat experience pushed the weapon's evolution further. American commanders wanted more than just a semi-automatic. They wanted a lightweight automatic weapon to provide suppressive fire in close combat. The answer was the M2 carbine, fitted with select fire capability, allowing soldiers to fire in fully automatic bursts. With a 30-round magazine and a cyclic rate of 750 rounds per minute, the M2 transformed the carbine into a compact assault weapon decades ahead of its time. Though it arrived in late 1944 and saw limited service, its presence hinted at the changing nature of small arms, lighter, faster, and more adaptable to fluid combat. Yet the true leap forward came not from firepower alone, but from vision, literally. In secret workshops, engineers at the Inland Division and research facilities across the country experimented with coupling the carbine to a device that seemed ripped from science fiction, an infrared sniper scope. The concept was daring. By projecting a beam of invisible infrared light and capturing the reflection through a sensitive electronic tube, soldiers could see in complete darkness. It was clumsy and heavy, requiring the operator to carry a carbine with a scope and an assistant to haul a massive 20-pound battery pack. But it worked. For the first time in history, a soldier could aim and fire at an enemy under the cover of absolute night. The prototype M3 carbine, fitted with this sniper scope, represented the fusion of two strands of American wartime ingenuity: the mass-produced lightweight rifle and the cutting-edge electronics born from radar research. It was no accident that General Motors, already producing carbines by the million, became central to the effort. Industrial America had proven not only its ability to flood the battlefield with weapons, but also its capacity to adapt, innovate, and merge disciplines once thought separate. Guns and radios, optics and batteries, now they converged into a single tool of war. For the men on the factory floor, the weapon was just one more product among thousands. At Inland's Dayton plant, rows of workers, many of them women replacing men drafted overseas, machined receivers, fitted barrels, and tested triggers. They worked long shifts under banners urging speed and quality. The faster we work, the faster they come home. Few of them understood that their handiwork would carry into battle not just as another rifle, but as a harbinger of the future. Each wooden stock and each steel bolt was part of a story bigger than themselves, a story in which industrial might gave American soldiers tools their enemies could not match. As the M3 prepared for deployment in the Pacific, those who studied its potential knew it was something far more than an adaptation. The carbine had begun as a humble solution for support troops, a stopgap between pistol and rifle. In the crucible of war, it had become a fully automatic weapon, and finally, a night-fighting system that would change tactics forever. What had started as an answer to mobility had evolved into the key to dominance after sunset. The origins of the M3 infrared carbine were not accidental. They were the product of necessity, innovation, and the unmatched power of American industry. And as it reached the battlefield in 1945, it carried with it a promise that no place, no time of day, and no element of nature would ever again guarantee safety for those who stood against the United States. The dawn of night vision had arrived, born from the simple need to lighten a soldier's burden, and it was about to cast its green glow across the darkest corners of the Pacific. The jungle was black as tar, the moon hidden behind thick Pacific clouds. An American infantryman crouched low in the underbrush, his breathing shallow, his hands gripping the wooden stock of a carbine that looked unlike any other. Atop its receiver sat a bulky, tube-like device, wires trailing down into a pack strapped to the back of his assistant. Ahead of him, the trees glowed in eerie shapes through his eyepiece. What was darkness to the naked eye became an otherworldly scene, branches shimmering in ghostly white, figures moving cautiously through the brush, their outlines crisp against the night. He shifted his rifle a fraction of an inch, placed the glowing silhouette of a Japanese soldier in his sights and squeezed the trigger. To his target, death arrived in total mystery. No flash, no visible beam, no warning. This was not merely shooting in the dark, it was engineering the invisible. The weapon in his hands was the M3 carbine fitted with the T3 infrared sniper scope, a device that marked one of the most extraordinary leaps in battlefield technology of the Second World War. While radar allowed fleets to detect aircraft over oceans and code-breaking unraveled secret messages, the sniper scope took the timeless human disadvantage of blindness in the dark and turned it into an American strength. It worked on a principle few soldiers understood, but all quickly came to trust. Mounted beneath the barrel was an infrared lamp, invisible to the naked eye, but flooding the battlefield with a cone of light in wavelengths beyond human vision. The sniper scope, equipped with an image converter tube, transformed those reflections into a green-tinted picture, giving the operator a silent, secret window into the night. This miracle of optics and electronics came with very real challenges. The sniper scope and its lamp added nearly 15 pounds to the carbine, and the battery pack required to power it weighed another 20. The operator was rarely alone. He moved with an assistant who carried spare batteries and helped change them under the cover of darkness. Battery life was short, sometimes less than 4 hours of continuous use, and recharging required generators and maintenance crews far behind the lines. Each infrared unit was not just a rifle, but a system, demanding logistics, coordination, and training in an army that prided itself on rugged simplicity. Yet, for all its complexity, the device worked. In tests across the Pacific, American soldiers marveled at its clarity. At ranges of 75 to 100 yards, they could spot Japanese infiltrators creeping through fields, identify figures crouching behind rocks, and track movements invisible to ordinary sentries. To men who had survived the shock of night raids, where enemy troops slipped silently into perimeters, throwing grenades into foxholes, the sense of empowerment was profound. Darkness no longer felt like a realm of fear. Through the glass of the sniper scope, it became a hunting ground. Behind every rifle shipped to the front was a story of relentless industrial effort. At the Inland Division of General Motors in Dayton, Ohio, engineers who had once designed automobile parts now oversaw the assembly of rifles adapted to mount the new scopes. Elsewhere, in laboratories drawing on radar research, physicists perfected the delicate image tubes that translated invisible light into something human eyes could perceive. On factory floors, women riveters and machinists worked under fluorescent lamps, producing the fragile cathode ray components with steady hands. Shipping crates marked "Sniper Scope, handle with care" were stacked high in depots, their contents bound for the jungles of Luzon, Leyte, and Okinawa. The system required far more than individual courage. Technicians in the Pacific constructed test ranges where soldiers fired carbines in simulated night ambushes. Power cables snaked across the dirt, batteries hummed as they discharged, and officers took notes on performance. Field manuals were written in hurried drafts, explaining in plain words how the lamp projected an invisible beam, how the operator must avoid pointing it at reflective surfaces that could wash out the image, and how precious the batteries were in combat. A misstep in handling the device could render it useless. Still, when deployed in battle, the M3 with its sniper scope was nothing short of a revelation. Japanese troops had long relied on darkness as their ally. They launched infiltration attacks with confidence, slipping past sentries and striking from the shadows. But when infrared-equipped patrols lay in wait, these assaults often ended in disaster. Soldiers advancing under the cover of midnight found themselves cut down before they fired a shot. Survivors described eerie experiences, comrades collapsing without seeing or hearing a muzzle flash, entire squads annihilated by an enemy who seemed to see through the night itself. Rumors of American death lamps spread quickly, shaking morale. For the Americans, the technology also brought its own tension. Operators bore heavy responsibility. Burdened by the scope and tied to their assistants with cables, they became high-value targets. If spotted, Japanese forces often concentrated their fire on the strange-looking equipment, desperate to silence it. Protecting the infrared gunners became a priority for their units, for without them, The edge of night vision vanished, and so the men carrying the M3 carbine with sniper scope often fought with an awareness that they were both hunters and hunted, wielding power few others possessed, but bearing risks that set them apart. The sheer novelty of the system meant that many soldiers had to learn as they fought. Some units experimented with tactics, placing infrared-equipped carbines in ambush points or using them to guard perimeters. Others tried integrating them into night patrols, advancing cautiously while scanning tree lines. Reports flowed back to headquarters. Successful ambushes, annihilated infiltration squads, occasional technical failures when batteries died too soon. Each combat action became another lesson, sharpening both the weapon and the doctrine surrounding it. In the broader sweep of the war, the sniper scope represented something more than just a tool. It embodied the convergence of America's two greatest strengths, industrial might and scientific innovation. To place such advanced optics in the hands of ordinary infantrymen was an achievement that no Axis power could match. Factories that had once built radios and televisions now supplied the components of night vision. Supply ships carried not only rifles and bullets, but fragile crates containing tubes and transformers. Entire chains of workers, engineers, and logisticians labored to ensure that, when night fell in the Pacific, American soldiers were no longer blind. The weapon was not perfect, nor was it deployed in numbers large enough to decide the war by itself. Fewer than 3,000 units reached the front by Okinawa, a fraction compared to the millions of rifles in service. Yet their effect was outsized. Each squad that carried one became a nightmare for infiltrators. Each ambush, a deadly trap sprung with invisible light. The psychological weight of the device, of an unseen eye watching in the dark, was worth as much as its tactical advantage. As the war neared its conclusion, commanders recognized what they held in their hands was not just another rifle, but a glimpse of warfare's future. The sniper scope hinted at a world where electronics and optics would dominate, where battles would no longer be limited by nightfall. The lessons learned in the Pacific would be carried forward into Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. Soldiers who once feared the night had begun to master it, thanks to a device born in laboratories and delivered through the unrelenting machine of American industry. And so, as American troops packed their scopes back into crates at the war's end, the legacy of the M3 infrared carbine was already written. It proved that the unseen could be engineered, that even darkness itself could be turned against the enemy. The night would never again belong entirely to those who sought to hide within it. ChatGPT said, "The night of April 1945 on Okinawa was alive with tension. The American lines stretched across jagged ridges and sugarcane fields, foxholes dug hastily into the soil. Men huddled in silence, their nerves raw from days of relentless artillery and kamikaze strikes. For weeks, Japanese forces had relied on night to strike fear into Allied camps, slipping past barbed wire to lob grenades or mounting sudden, screaming bonsai charges designed to overwhelm defenders before dawn. Every man knew that once the sun fell behind the Pacific horizon, survival became a gamble. But on this island, something had changed. Tonight, for the first time in the Pacific War, American soldiers could see in the dark. Through the eyepiece of an M3 infrared carbine, the battlefield glowed with ghostly light. A private from the 96th Infantry Division peered into the glass tube, his finger resting on the trigger. Shapes emerged in the distance. Figures crouching, moving low across the terrain, unaware they were being watched. To the naked eye, there was only a black expanse, but to the carbine operator, the Japanese soldiers appeared sharp and luminous, their rifles glinting faintly under the invisible beam. The private whispered to his assistant to steady the power pack, then squeezed off a burst. The silhouettes crumpled instantly. Around him, other infrared gunners were firing too, their rifles spitting death into the darkness. What followed was unlike anything the Japanese had ever faced. Men dropping in silence before they realized they had been discovered. Night attacks collapsing in confusion. Entire squads erased without warning. The deployment of just 150 M3 carbines on Okinawa marked a turning point in night fighting. They were scattered in small detachments across the island, assigned to ambush points, perimeter defenses, and forward patrols. Though their numbers were tiny compared to the hundreds of thousands of rifles on the island, Their impact was enormous. For American commanders, the battle provided the first opportunity to test whether the cumbersome sniper scope system could withstand the brutal conditions of Pacific combat. For the Japanese, it was a nightmare. For years, Japanese doctrine had emphasized the darkness as a weapon. At Guadalcanal, New Georgia, and Bougainville, they had inflicted severe casualties with infiltration tactics. Small teams crept into foxholes, bayonets flashing in the night. Entire companies charged screaming from the shadows, their cries of "Tenno Heika Banzai" meant to terrify defenders as much as to kill them. By 1945, every American soldier in the Pacific had been taught to fear nightfall. But Okinawa was different. Now, instead of blindly firing into the darkness, soldiers could target precisely. Each infrared unit could watch the approaches to American lines like a hunter stalking prey. When Japanese soldiers attempted to crawl forward with grenades or knives, the operators picked them off methodically, one by one. First-hand accounts from the battle describe how disorienting it was for the enemy. Survivors told of comrades falling beside them, struck by unseen bullets from an invisible enemy. There was no muzzle flash, no spotlight to betray the Americans. Men stumbled back in panic, retreating from an attack that seemed to come from the night itself. Some described the uncanny sensation of being watched, of eyes piercing the darkness, stripping away their last refuge. The legendary ferocity of the Banzai charge, once capable of overwhelming defenders through shock and sheer momentum, now became an act of suicide. Charging blindly into an invisible crossfire, Japanese infantry were cut down in swaths, their cries swallowed by the thunder of gunfire. One after-action report noted that a single M3-equipped team, defending a sector of less than 200 yards, accounted for dozens of confirmed kills in a single night. The ratio was staggering, a handful of rifles inflicting casualties equal to entire companies. The Japanese, who had once used darkness to even the odds, now found themselves at a disadvantage so severe it bordered on hopeless. Officers encouraged soldiers to keep charging, to trust in courage and spirit, but spirit could not shield against a bullet guided by technology. Still, the Americans faced challenges. The M3 carbine was far from perfect. The scopes were heavy and fragile, batteries often ran out mid-patrol, and assistants carrying spare packs became prime targets. The humidity of Okinawa corroded electrical connections, forcing constant maintenance. Operators trained themselves to swap batteries in the dark, fingers fumbling with wires as the enemy crept closer. Some feared the heavy packs would explode if struck by shrapnel. Yet even with these flaws, the weapon transformed the battlefield. Its successes outweighed every inconvenience. At the tactical level, commanders quickly learned how best to employ their limited supply. Infrared carbines were placed at choke points, trails, gullies, and approaches where infiltration was likely. Others guarded artillery emplacements, shielding the guns from sabotage. A few were given to night patrols, whose mission shifted from simply surviving the darkness to actively hunting in it. Men who once dreaded leaving the safety of camp at night now walked with cautious confidence, their scopes glowing with the light of enemies who had no idea they had been exposed. For the Japanese, the psychological toll was devastating. Reports from survivors tell of men whispering about American death lights, of rumors spreading that the enemy had found a way to make the night itself betray them. Fear corroded morale. Commanders found their men reluctant to attempt night attacks, worried that they were being watched before they even moved. The darkness, once their shield, had become a trap. The battle for Okinawa was already among the bloodiest of the Pacific. Over 100,000 Japanese soldiers would die, and American casualties would climb above 12,000. Amid such carnage, the M3 carbine was not decisive in numbers, but in meaning. It showed how the United States, by fusing science with mass production, could strip away one of the last advantages of its enemy. A weapon that existed in only 150 units had changed the very character of night fighting. When the sun rose over Okinawa after another long night, American soldiers knew that the balance of power had shifted. They had seen with their own eyes how small teams armed with futuristic rifles had broken centuries of tradition in war. Darkness was no longer neutral ground. It was American ground, lit not by the moon, but by invisible beams no enemy could resist. In the closing weeks of the campaign, as kamikaze planes hurled themselves at American ships offshore, and Japanese defenders fought to the last man in caves and tunnels, the M3 carbine continued to exact its toll. Each successful ambush added to the growing conviction among American commanders that the weapon was a glimpse of the future. The night, once feared, had become an ally. And for the Japanese soldiers still clinging to their shattered defenses, it was a promise of relentless defeat, a sign that even in darkness, there was no escape. The jungle air was heavy, thick with the scent of mud and cordite. A Japanese sergeant knelt in the shadows, his face streaked with grime, his hands trembling as he gripped his Arisaka rifle. Around him, the remnants of his squad whispered in hushed voices, preparing for another night infiltration. For years, darkness had been their ally. When the sun sank, they became phantoms, sliding past sentries, bayonets gleaming, striking terror into Americans who could no longer see their own hands. Tonight, though, the sergeant felt a cold dread. Already rumors had spread through the battalion, men vanishing in silence, comrades shot down as if illuminated by unseen lanterns. He looked into the blackness, but it seemed alive, watching him. He raised his hand to signal the advance, and within moments, his soldiers slipped forward into the night. Seconds later, the darkness itself erupted. Invisible beams found them, bullets struck with uncanny precision, and the sergeant collapsed without ever seeing the enemy who had taken his life. For Japanese soldiers on Okinawa, this was the collapse of a doctrine that had been cultivated for decades. Night was supposed to be their refuge. In China, before the Pacific War, Japanese forces had used darkness to infiltrate enemy positions with devastating success. In the Philippines, Malaya, and Burma, they launched sudden attacks after sunset, driving Allied troops from defenses with bayonets and grenades. Night was the great equalizer, masking deficiencies in firepower and mechanization. A U.S. Marine who fought on Guadalcanal recalled that, when the sun went down, you could feel it in your bones. You knew they were coming. Darkness belonged to the Japanese, or so it seemed, until 1945. The arrival of the M3 infrared carbine changed everything. To American infantrymen peering through the sniper scope, the battlefield glowed like a ghostly theater. To Japanese soldiers, the battlefield remained pitch black, yet every movement betrayed them. They tried their old tricks, creeping low through the grass, stripping down to loincloths to make less noise, painting faces with soot and mud. They spread out in looser formations to avoid mass casualties. Some attempted decoys, sending small groups forward to draw fire while larger forces flanked. Others, in acts of sheer desperation, hurled themselves forward in reckless charges, hoping to overwhelm the handful of infrared gunners before they could reload or replace dying batteries. But the result was always the same. Death fell on them with uncanny precision. Japanese diaries recovered after the battle paint a vivid picture of despair. One soldier wrote, "The Americans see us even in the dark. We crawl, we hide, but their bullets find us. The night is no longer ours." Another entry, from a corporal in the 62nd Division, described the uncanny terror of comrades falling without warning. "The blackness hides us, but they shoot as if it is daylight. I cannot understand it. We are like insects under a lantern, waiting to be crushed." These were not the words of men preparing for glorious sacrifice, but of soldiers confronting futility. The collapse of night tactics was more than psychological. It was strategic. Japanese commanders had relied on nighttime infiltration to offset America's overwhelming firepower. Artillery, tanks, and air support meant the daylight battlefield was suicide. Night offered their only chance to harass, disrupt, and inflict casualties. On Okinawa, with American positions illuminated by the unseen beams of the M3, those tactics became worse than useless. They became slaughter. Officers ordered more attacks, convinced that courage could break the spell, but courage alone could not overcome technology. The very foundations of Japanese night doctrine crumbled. Desperation gave rise to brutality. Some units sent men forward on sacrificial runs, carrying nothing but grenades strapped to their bodies, hoping to detonate among the American gunners before being cut down. Others tried to blind the infrared scopes with smoke or to fire blindly in their direction, but the scopes simply shifted focus, guiding their operators as calmly as before. Whole platoons vanished in minutes, their bodies littering the approaches to American lines. A sergeant from the 77th Infantry Division recalled how, "We stopped thinking of night attacks as dangerous. With those scopes, it was like shooting at targets on a range." What had once been the most feared Japanese tactic became, in the words of one American officer, a gift of easy kills. For the Japanese, the effect on morale was catastrophic. Soldiers whispered of invisible death beams and magic eyes that stripped them of their last hope. The mythology of the banzai charge, that spirit could overcome firepower, shattered under the invisible gaze of the M3. A private's final letter to his family, recovered in the ruins of Shuri, confessed that we no longer believe victory is possible. Even the night has turned against us. That sense of futility pervaded the Japanese defense, gnawing at the last threads of determination. Meanwhile, American soldiers gained confidence. Patrols that once dreaded leaving camp after dusk now moved with calm assurance, scopes guiding their steps. Perimeters once braced for night raids now watched ambushes unfold with lethal clarity. To the Americans, the contrast was stark. Their enemy stumbling blindly, their own rifles piercing the blackness. The asymmetry of morale was as decisive as the bullets themselves. The collapse of Japanese night tactics on Okinawa symbolized more than battlefield defeat. It was the death of an idea that sheer willpower could overcome industrial superiority. For years, Japanese soldiers had believed that courage and darkness could compensate for lack of tanks, planes, or artillery. On Okinawa, they discovered that even the night could be taken from them. It was a cruel revelation, one that left them stripped not just of tactics, but of hope. And yet, even as they died in waves beneath the invisible beams, they did not surrender. They charged, they crawled, they hurled grenades in desperate futility, because surrender was forbidden. The result was carnage, men sacrificing themselves against an enemy who no longer fought in the dark, but above it, beyond it, illuminated by a science they could not match. In the end, the story of Japan's failed night tactics was not merely one of battlefield defeat, but of a broader collapse. The realization that in the face of American innovation and industry, no amount of sacrifice could prevail. The night, once their greatest ally, had become their grave. And as Okinawa descended into its final weeks of slaughter, one truth became undeniable. Japan was running out not only of men and weapons, but of ideas. The battlefield was silent except for the hum of the battery pack. An American infantryman shifted his weight in the mud, peering through the bulky tube of the sniper scope. Through its green-tinted glow, he saw movement, a figure rising cautiously from the shadows of a ridge. The soldier squeezed the trigger, and the figure crumpled instantly. To the Japanese infantryman who had fallen, there was no warning, no visible enemy, no explanation. Only the incomprehensible reality of death delivered from the dark. It was 1945 and the night itself had been stolen. The M3 infrared Carbines combat debut was limited, confined to a few hundred units at Okinawa and the Philippines, yet its implications were profound. What had begun as an experiment, an ungainly combination of rifle, lamp, and heavy battery, was the first true battlefield night vision system. Its effectiveness was not measured in the volume of fire it produced, but in the way it redefined the struggle for dominance after sunset. For the Japanese, who had relied on the night as their last ally, the effect was devastating. For American troops, it was a revelation. Though awkward and heavy, the M3 offered a glimpse of a future where darkness no longer dictated the terms of battle. When the war ended in August 1945, crates of infrared carbines were packed away, some stored in depots, others shipped back to research facilities. At first, their future seemed uncertain. The weapon was too rare to have altered the outcome of the Pacific War, and many saw it as just another curiosity of wartime innovation. But military scientists and planners recognized its potential. Reports from Okinawa were studied in detail, enemy infiltration units destroyed, ambushes sprung with precision, morale shaken by what survivors called invisible death beams. These documents were not shelved and forgotten. They became the foundation for the next stage of development. Within 5 years, the world would see the M3's descendants in action. The Korean War broke out in 1950, and once again American forces faced waves of night assaults, this time from Chinese and North Korean troops who favored infiltration and human wave tactics. Out came the infrared systems, refined since Okinawa. Larger, more powerful scopes, mounted not only on carbines, but also on machine guns and even tanks, provided American defenders with the same uncanny ability to pierce the dark. At battles like Chipyong-ni and Heartbreak Ridge, infrared technology multiplied the lethality of American firepower, allowing defenders to mow down attackers who believed the night concealed them. The lessons learned in the mud of Okinawa were carried directly into the frozen hills of Korea, and the evolution did not stop there. In Vietnam, 2 decades later, second-generation night vision systems based on image intensification, the ability to amplify even the faintest natural light, began to appear. Unlike the M3, they no longer required heavy infrared lamps or assistants lugging 20-pound battery packs. Soldiers could now peer through lighter, more reliable scopes, turning the jungles of Southeast Asia into battlegrounds where guerrillas could no longer assume darkness was protection. By the 1970s, helicopter pilots, tank crews, and infantry squads carried night vision devices as standard equipment, tracing their lineage directly back to the clumsy, fragile carbines first tested against Japanese infiltrators in 1945. Yet the legacy of the M3 was more than technical. It carried with it the memory of the men who bore its weight and those who died under its invisible gaze. For American infantrymen, using the M3 meant long nights burdened by fragile equipment, watching glowing figures in the darkness, and pulling the trigger before the enemy ever saw them. Some described the surreal experience of killing men who, to the naked eye, weren't even there. For Japanese soldiers, the legacy was one of despair. Entire squads wiped out in silence, letters home filled with confusion about an enemy who could see in the dark. Their courage, once magnified by the blackness of night, dissolved in the face of an unseen power. The human cost of that shadow war was immense. On Okinawa alone, more than 100,000 Japanese troops perished, many in night assaults that the M3 helped break apart. American soldiers, too, bore scars from the experience. Carrying the new weapons was exhausting and dangerous. Operators were prime targets once the enemy realized their importance. Assistants hauling heavy batteries often felt like walking bullseyes, and yet they persisted, because they understood what was at stake. Each successful ambush, each foiled infiltration, meant more Americans alive when dawn broke. Looking back, the M3 infrared carbine symbolized more than just a technological milestone. It was the embodiment of a truth that defined the Second World War. Industrial power and scientific innovation could overturn even the most ancient laws of battle. Darkness, long the equalizer of the weak against the strong, was stripped away by the marriage of optics, electronics, and mass production. Just as radar had stolen surprise from the skies, and code-breaking had stolen secrecy from communications, the M3 had stolen the night itself. Today, every soldier who peers through a lightweight night vision goggle, every pilot who guides his aircraft through darkness as if flying at noon, and every commander who plans operations unconstrained by sunset, owes something to the crude, cumbersome rifles first carried on Okinawa. The lineage is clear. The green glow that modern soldiers know so well began with those ghostly silhouettes seen in 1945. But the legacy also carries a somber reminder. For the Japanese infantryman who fell without ever glimpsing his killer, the M3 represented a war already lost, not just on the battlefield, but in the race of ideas and industry. And for the Americans who bore the burden of pioneering it, it was proof that victory came not only through courage and sacrifice, but through the relentless harnessing of science in the service of war. In the end, the story of the M3 infrared carbine is not just about a weapon. It is about the moment when mankind took the final sanctuary of the soldier, the cover of night, and turned it into another domain of control. From the foxholes of Okinawa to the mountains of Korea and the jungles of Vietnam, the dawn of night vision reshaped the battlefield forever. And its first light, faint and green, flickered from the sniper scopes of a few hundred weary soldiers in 1945, who proved that even darkness itself could be conquered.